And today's episode is all about spirituality, qi, and martial arts. So welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Asians Represent podcast. This is episode 36, and we're going to be talking about qi. Or I guess we should say ki in the D&D sense, and in the this is a heavy book, and in the the Pathfinder sense.
You got a second edition rule book.
I've had this for a really long time, and I didn't crack it open until today.
Oh, to look at the monk.
To look at the monk.
Crisp.
Yeah.
It's very crisp. I'm a fan of the first edition of Pathfinder. And we've talked about this a lot.
I'm a fan of the second, actually. So
But-
there you go.
so, like,
our knowledge can complete.
So yeah, our knowledge can complete it. But I'm very interested with what I read, and I'm happy that you kind of prompted me to do it.
Yeah.
But one of the things that we were going to talk about for this episode of the podcast is what to do with the monk in D&D, because the monk kind of falls into this really interesting place where it doesn't quite fit. It's in a way clearly inspired by Asian cultures, specifically Chinese culture, but at the same time it doesn't lean into those things. What it does is it's we're kind of Asian but not, but there are parts of us that are very explicitly Chinese. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And it's the key point. So, Agatha, what's up?
Gosh, I hate that. I'm sorry.
There's the podcast. There's the podcast right there. So it's the key point. And I feel like Agatha's gonna hold back. I can see it right now. Agatha just hold it back.
I mean,
laughing.
that's one of my biggest pet peeves with the class.
Just call it chi.
The fact that they call them key points.
It's almost like they were you know what? We don't want to be disrespectful to Chinese people, but we're gonna totally take this thing, make it mystical, combat magic, and we'll change one letter. And it's still kind of sound the same.
A lot of the monk subclass as well, like the Kensei, that's why are you giving a character class that is clearly influenced by Shaolin monks a subclass that is a Japanese master swordsman, Miyamoto Musashi, and then I don't know, ki. I think that's a great place to start, because the fact that they call them key points is actually one of my pet peeves with the class.
Just call it chi. It's the same thing with the world of Avatar, because there are chi blockers in Avatar. But if we're going to talk about Avatar, it's really interesting comparing it to D&D, because I didn't even plan on this, but I think it's a really interesting point of comparison with how Avatar actually portrayed elements of Chinese spirituality and medicine and understanding of qi, which is really cool. And when they literally show the meridian points and stuff like that, I think it's awesome. But I think what we have to do, especially for Agatha, because you are not a hardcore D&D player, and I think your perspective is actually potentially one of the most valuable things in the room right now, because Jeremy, Steve, and I are incredibly biased towards D&D, and I think having you is really great for the audience, because they're going to learn a lot from this conversation. So there are 3 things that I wrote down from the Player's Handbook about the D&D monk and ki. So the D&D monk is kind of referenced 2 ways. There's a table that kind of does a breakdown of all the classes, and in it says the monk is a master of martial arts, harnessing the power of the body in pursuit of physical and spiritual perfection. It's pretty vague, right? Then, in the actual monk section, it says, there's a section that says, because they kind of go through and provide 3 examples of 3 different kinds of monks. It says, whatever their discipline, monks are united in their ability to magically harness the energy that flows in their bodies, whether channeled as a striking display of combat prowess or a subtler focus of defensive ability and speed. This energy infuses all that a monk does. And then it goes and says, monks make careful study of a magical energy that most monastic traditions call ki. This energy is an element of the magic that suffuses the multiverse, specifically the element that flows through living bodies. Monks harness this power within themselves to create magical effects and exceed their body's physical capabilities. And some of their special attacks can hinder the flow of ki in their opponents. Using this energy, monks channel uncanny speed and strength into their unarmed strikes. As they gain experience, their martial training and their mastery of ki gives them more power over their bodies and the bodies of their foes. So that's for like you, Agatha, Jeremy, Steve, myself, and the audience who are kind of listening. This is what we're going to be basing our conversation on. And there are a couple of key things here to talk about when it comes to the monk.
Sorry, you said key things.
Damn it.
The reason why I reacted so strongly when you said key points is because I thought you were making a pun. But anyway.
I wasn't, but now I'm going to be like, and the critical points of conversation, the important points of conversation opens up my thesaurus. Now you're in my head, Agatha. Dang it. So I was literally just about to say the key points, the important points, the important things to point. Oh, God damn it. The important things to point out here is that, obviously like D&D and the monk and ki as a source of magical energy is portrayed as something that is to be utilized for combat. That's how it's framed to new players, right? This is something that you use to exceed your body's natural abilities to do combat, right? It talks about how it's just like, you channel this power, the force, into your unarmed strikes, which is another thing to note. It's the unarmed strike that we're talking about right here, at least based on this text. And when you look at like wuxia shows that kind of show these sorts of different sort of like ki infused martial arts, people use a variety of weapons. And that's something that you don't really see, or at least isn't kind of communicated to the readers or to the gamers when it comes to the D&D monk. Now, before we go into, D&D ki versus like Chinese chi, I wanted to kind of turn to like you, Jeremy, and you, Steve, given that you two play a lot of D&D, and ask like kind of how you've played and if you've played monk characters and how you've kind of taken this.
So monks have always been like a sticking point for me in D&D. I always felt tension around them that I couldn't really express in a meaningful way to an audience that would understand kind of the nuance I'm going for, or understand where like some of this tension might have its roots in. But I will say that if I focus on this text as we've read it so far, the first part of it is very much you're a fighter, you're a warrior. There is no other difference. Every fighter out there in the game more or less is achieving physical and certainly spiritual perfection, because everyone who talks about fighters, they talk about like a fighting spirit or like indomitable will or things like that. Like that's part of the game. That is spirit as far as I'm concerned. So the first couple of sentences do not differentiate monk at all. And then it goes and differentiates the monk to say, oh, there's like a mystical power within them. Sure. But it's, if you look at the whole, it's only accessible by monks, by the Asians. And like that has like always touched me in a way that I'm like, I want to talk about this more, but who can I really talk to this about? So that's my biggest rub, I guess, with monks. As such, I have only ever played one monk in my entire life. And we were playing like a wild multi-universal like campaign. The multiverse is under destruction. We could play any character for any world. I asked the DM, do you mean any world? And they said yes. So I said, great. I picked North America, 2016. I'm an ex MMA fighter. My name's Ryan the Iron Man Hong, and I run like a gym, and I get teleported to D&D, and I'm just really good at punching stuff. And all of your talk about ki, chi, and all this like magical stuff, I don't understand it. And I don't care because all of you seem to not be able to like take a punch really. So that's where I'm at. That was great. That was fun for me. But also it was fun for me basically because of the subversion.
Yeah. How about you, Jeremy?
Yeah, so I don't mind monks in the sense that I think I'm glad that they exist within the game. Like when I was first getting into D&D and I was going through the classes, I was like, oh, monk, cool. That's the Asian one. Like that's what I thought. And then I read through it a little bit. And I liked some things when I first read it, and I didn't like some things. As time has gone on, I find the monk to be an interesting class. I like talking about it, but I haven't played as a monk myself because the class as it is in D&D 5e has never really hit me the right way. Like Steve said, the emphasis on using chi or ki for combat is it's not really what chi actually is. And even when D&D has tried to introduce like a healing focused monk, like the Order of Mercy, I linked
I was so
everybody.
disappointed when
I linked everybody here
so
a video
disappointed.
Of Jeremy Crawford talking about the Order of Mercy monk, and that initially appealed to me because I was like, wow, a monk focused around healing. They could bring in like aspects of Chinese medicine, but actually Jeremy Crawford said the intent with that class was to pull the monk away from its Eastern origins and make it into like a Western traveling monk with like a plague mask on for whatever reason. And to me, that's just
the cleric.
Yeah, to me, that's the cleric. But here we go again. Like monks originally in I think the earliest editions of the game started as like a subclass of clerics, and they were called mystics for a while too. And so monks have always like jumped back and forth between how exactly is D&D going to define this, you know, quite frankly, like Asian character class in the middle of a game where a lot of the other character classes are based on Western European concepts. And I think every edition has gone through some problems trying to define that. Like fourth edition equated key points with like psionic power and stuff like that. And so there's this really back and forth where D&D doesn't really know what to do with the monk. And I think fifth edition, there's still that feeling. So I haven't played as a monk personally, but in the games that I have GM'd, a lot of my players of color, usually Chinese, have played as monks, and they have a lot of fun. And so I like watching them have fun. I played in a game recently where my friend's no monk like jumped off the balcony of a tavern and punched a grell in the face. And
Nice.
he was describing his actions to the GM, and the GM was like, "Oh, you're doing some wuxia shit. That's awesome." Like, and so that I think is really cool. And that's why I'm glad the monk exists, because there is. I have friends who have used the class to really exhibit some fun, you know, things relevant to their heritage. But I think when you really dive down into it, it doesn't quite like I think it can be improved, and that's why we're here.
One of the players in my weekly game is a chi draining Dampier.
Yeah, a cheat. See, there are interesting
Dampier
things
monk.
you can do
Yeah.
with the monk there. Like one of my character concepts in my head that I came up with while walking the dog the other day was like a warforged monk. Like, how does a warforged character work with the idea of ki? You know, the ki, which or ki or chi, which is supposed to flow through everything. And there's lots of interesting potentials there. So
You know
yeah,
what's a, you know what's a really interesting
love that.
you know what's a really interesting story? If you're like, obviously there's lore behind Warforged and why there's sentience and all of that. But like, what if you're like a Warforged and you're like, am I a living thing?
absolutely. That's what you get to
do
play
I
with.
have chi? But then that in and of itself isn't how chi works, or ki.
Yeah.
Or do I have ki? But that isn't how chi works, right? I think the monk is really interesting because, like Steve, you mentioned, I think you had a really great tweet that we retweeted from Asians Represent, where you were talking about how this is not something you talk about in like the D&D spaces that you occupy, because there's nobody there who can you could have this sort of conversation with, this nuanced conversation with. And I think it's because like, A, because of not fitting in, B, because I don't think the monk fits in with the way the classes are set up, right? You mentioned that like, yeah, that first thing I said, the master of martial arts, harnessing the power of the body in pursuit of physical and spiritual perfection. That could be so many things. But D&D does this thing where the words martial arts are meant to mean hand-to-hand combat. And that's a problem, right? Because, if you practice HEMA, historical European martial arts, like it's the combat arts, right? The fighter is like a master of weaponry and tactics. They are a martial artist, right? The barbarian is that like, I always, in my head, if I were to play a barbarian, my barbarian just looks like Sammo Hung. My barbarian looks like Sammo Hung and fights like Sammo Hung, right? Because, Sammo Hung can move.
Sammo Hung is awesome.
Yeah, he can move. But, like, the barbarian is in a way, like, they could exceed their physical limits. Like, I rage. Like, how does that work?
There's an interesting video on the YouTube channel DM It All that just talks about the monk, and I think it's headlined under, like, the monk is like the worst character class. It's kind of a clickbaity title, but they talk about how when the TSR folks were making the monk, like the guys who made Blackmore and were inserting the monk into that, edition of what would eventually become Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, all of the other classes were kind of built from research into Western Europe history and myths and mythology and stuff like that. But the monk represented like fanboyism, basically, because the monk was influenced specifically by Kung Fu, the TV series with David Carradine, who was supposed to be a half Asian dude, but they couldn't find an actual half Asian dude, so they cast David Carradine in there. And
with a great Asian accent. They asked him to do an Asian accent, and what is on TV is the best he could do, and they were like, that's you got it.
You tried.
Yeah. And these pulp novels called the Destroyer series, which features a guy who learns martial arts from his esoteric, mystical Asian old man friend. And that's really where like the ideas of the monk came from. So the ideas that the monk is a good, martial artist just come from the fact that I think the creators thought that Kung Fu was cool. They didn't really think of anything beyond unarmed strikes and like, flurry of blows, and like quivering death punches there. So the monk really, the monk is based on tropes more than a lot of other D&D classes. I mean, the barbarian is also based on tropes like from Conan and stuff, but I think the monk is based on, I guess, more recent tropes like Kung Fu. It's a show from the 60s, and Destroyer novels also from, I believe, the 50s or the 60s. So I think that's why there is slight disconnect and why the monk has always been undergoing slight revisions as TSR and then Wizards of the Coast try to grapple with how to wrangle, the benefits of this class and make it exist in a world that is mostly Western Europe.
That's the thing, right? It's all about trying to make it exist. So while I am sure that though the folks who are, we were working on 5th edition were like, yeah, qi is key, right? We get it. It's Chinese medicine, the works, right? But we have to fit it within this system, right? And this is a world where magic is, and we could talk about like the weave in the Forgotten Realms, but magic comes from these very specific things. So
I feel like the weave is kind of like chi. Like, I don't know.
The weave is kind of like chi.
When I read about the weave, and I read about like chi, it's kind of the same. And I read about like psionic energy. It is kind of the same, but I think grouping chi or ki as this mystical energy that only the Asian class can influence, that's where the problems start, as Steve said.
I would like to put a pin in that idea for later on, because I feel like we're not done with D&D just yet.
Yeah.
But from what we're reading and my own experiences with how energy, because my family never used the word chi, like it just didn't come up. The way the weave is written feels like a westernization of the concept of it, which is like, you're going to see it, it's going to happen. But I feel like the deep dive into that is something I want to dive into more later on.
Do we want to touch on the weave later on in the episode then?
If we have time, yeah. Or it might just come up naturally.
Or we could just do, honestly, I think it might be interesting to do a whole episode on different forms of like Chinese magic and talk about the East Asian spellcaster, because that in and of itself is a whole episode.
That is very interesting. So, Daniel, I saw what you put in the show notes on your section about how, like, the equivalency of ki in D&D is basically like neigong, or like inner inner
the inner
energy,
arts.
inner power,
Yeah.
inner arts, like within the martial arts media, right? Where it's less about like a specific essence with its own like philosophical origins, and more just like a like I got my power, and because I trained in some way, so therefore now I can like just like muster it up, which is very much like those wuxia films and or TV shows, right?
So would you say that ki in D&D is a means to which you can enact tropes? And therefore that's why it's there, right? Because it's like, how do I do these really interesting and sort of tropey and clearly Asian coded feats of like superhuman feats? How do I do that if I'm not a spellcaster and I don't have spells per day? How do we make this different? As a designer, you're like, well, we need to give it some sort of currency. Mystical chi, we'll call it ki. Is that what you're saying?
I guess so. Like the way that I read the D&D text was that, oh, so this is the inner arts, and it's basically the same thing. It just has a different name, and I don't really see a difference, because a lot of times, like in wuxia stories, like it's not explained either. So
yeah, but
it does feel very mystical in a way.
But in a way, though, I think that, you know, with the inner arts, with like the sort of the external martial arts, the Wuxia, the fast, explosive sort of martial arts, and then you've got the neijia, which is like the inner arts, like the cultivating, the chi, and all that. Like, I think when you're reading a wuxia story or you're consuming that kind of media, the audience for those, the intended audience for those, are also people who have at least some level of understanding of where chi fits within the broader world.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right? Because like, so, and I think this is a great way of kind of talking about where chi fits in D&D by first talking about where ki fits in D&D, and first talking about where chi fits in Chinese culture. Right? So when we were kind of looking at chi, I basically took 2 academic papers that I found and was like, we should try to read these 2. And I read one, and I was like, this paper is a mindfuck. Like, I read it, and after I was done reading it, I was like, what the fuck is chi? And how can you take something so complex, so specific, yet so ambiguous, and reduce it down to a currency for cool things? And I don't say that as like I'm offended. I'm saying that as like what is the design rationale behind that? So, you know, for those who have never heard of ki before, ki is just like this fundamental component of ancient Chinese and contemporary Chinese culture, right?
You mean chi?
Chi, sorry. See, now I'm all mixed up. Chi, thank you. And, you know, it finds itself in, you know, like traditional Chinese medicine. It finds itself in martial arts, philosophy, and things like that. And when I was looking at it, it's like, what is chi? And in the notes that I wrote, I pointed out 2 interesting quotes from a paper that we all read. And so this paper was called A Differentiation in the Meaning of Qi on Several Levels, a title that is clearly a translation from a Chinese title. Now, the first quote is from a Warring States period text. So this is like over 2,000 years old, right? By a philosopher named Sun Kuang. And it says, and this is what kind of messed me up because I was trying to think, what is Qi? And it says, water and fire have chi, but they have no life. Grasses and trees have life, but they have no knowledge. Birds and beasts have knowledge, but they have no sense of righteousness or justice. Human beings have chi, life, knowledge, and also a sense of righteousness and justice. Thus, human beings are the most valuable thing under heaven. So then you start thinking like, well, if water and fire have chi, what is chi? What is chi? And
So I kind
go ahead.
sorry,
Go ahead.
finish.
Go ahead.
Okay, I kind of wanted to talk about the various combination of characters that chi is used in. So, like, for example, one of the things that is like life essence that is talking, like, one of the things that is mentioned in this article is like, I mean, this paper is that, like, when you're first born, like, traditional, this is like from before the philosophy of like how life comes to be. Like when a child is born, then you get an essence of like the world born into you, and that gives you life, and it's called yuan qi. So that's one of them. Another thing that is kind of like, I think you can maybe define it as, I think there's probably a better way of translating it, but what I think of is like, it's like id is xie qi, which is like xie is blood and qi is breath, and that's like the kind of like your primal impulses and like various appetites. And then so like in order to be like a righteous person, that's like the philosophy is that you need to like control them, and at different stages of your life you need to control different things, you know. But it's like chi is, when it's used in different ways, like it signifies different things, like a lot of characters are. So like I feel like chi in a lot of usages is just, it just means essence of something, right? Like yuan qi is the essence of the world, like whatever it's that like causes the life. And then there's like, you know, when you think about yin and yang, yin yang, it's like there's yin qi and yang qi, and that it's just talking about the flow of it. It's not like talking about like the like, yeah, it's talking, it always seems to be, from the very little bit that I have read, which is just this article and these two articles, it's like, it's always like essence. It's not necessarily that it takes a corporeal and or physical form, but it's like, and it's, so it's not necessarily like energy, but it is like an essence of things. Jeremy,
because I was just going to say, like, chi can also be used in terms of describing something artistic, like the chi of like this piece of like music, or like the chi of a performance that you go and watch, or something, you know, radiates a certain type of chi. So it's, I mean, I didn't really understand this concept until I lived in Taiwan and in Hong Kong, but you just like, you kind of get it after a while, especially if you end up studying Chinese. Like, it's just, chi is just, everything has chi, not just living things. Like, it's just an essence, as Agatha said, of the world and of all the things inside of it. Like, I mean, my computer is radiating a certain type of chi right now, RGB chi, but that, like, that's how I feel in terms of chi. Everything has chi.
Yeah.
And D&D gets that a little wrong in their interpretation of, well, what they call ki, which is the Japanese version of chi.
And again, that's why I feel like, to me, it doesn't, like, it just feels like, yeah, like there was an initial, like, not really an attempt to understand the differences, and just like choosing something that sounds cool, fitting it on a different concept that it doesn't really have anything to do with. But so like, as someone who doesn't come from like a D&D perspective and trying to understand it, like, and trying to play it, I'm kind of, it doesn't actually bother me very much, because I'm just like, oh, it's just a misnomer, but it's exactly this other thing, and therefore I am understanding it exactly as like Nate Lee, like in the inner energy, inner
arts,
power, inner energy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
D&D is not the only game to do this. Like, a lot of people confuse like chi and ki and whatever. Like, I remember the first time I came upon the word ki was actually when I was watching like Dragon Ball Z fan subs, as a kid. They're talking about his ki is over like 25,000. Like when Vegeta says like his energy is over 9,000, they subtitled it as ki, and that's where I first heard the term. So this kind of the idea that like chi is specifically like combat energy and not really like an essence of being, I think is quite prevalent in all sorts of media. Sorry for interrupting you, Agatha.
And I think
No, it's fine.
and one thing I wanted to add is that, Agatha, you talked about almost like how it is intangible, yet it is also there. And I think that's where a lot of Chinese philosophers also associated with like air and the breath, because they are things that are there, but you cannot feel. You can't grab a breath, but you know it's there, and it's associated with life, right? And there was this other philosopher in that article that said that qi is a condition for life, and lifeless things are formed by qi, talking about how qi kind of, and in the article, and we'll put this in the show notes for our patrons, in the article it kind of talks about how like there are different definitions of qi depending on the context. And in one, they kind of said, qi is this production and transformation. It exists in this cycle of production and transformation where things are constantly being made and lifeless things are turning into things with life or associating themselves with things with life. And it was so interesting because in trying to understand what qi is, and if you really take the time to do it respectfully, it really turns into this question of why is it in D&D in the first place? And should it be in D&D in the first place? And does it fit within the world of D&D? Now, a part of me, that the way I would do it is that, and this is kind of what I've tried to do with Candlekeep, and I'm sure we can talk about the challenges of that later, is I like this with gods too, with the deities in D&D. I like the idea that if these things are real and they manifest themselves in reality, like obviously the deities do that in D&D all the time, right? They manifest themselves in a reality where the mortals can understand it, right? And, qi manifests itself in the form of, in D&D, a key, I guess, combat mechanics, right? And these superhuman feats where you can like, the qinggong, and you can like jump really far, like people know from Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon and stuff like that. But what if, this is kind of how I always saw it, what if all the different gods that you see across all of these different settings are all just the same thing and people are having their own different interpretations of them, right? And what if this magic, this thing that flows through everything in the world, perhaps we could talk about the weave, this raw energy that everything is a part of, yet cannot perceive. What if there are scholars who say, yeah, with this kind of study, we can harness it, and they became wizards and they called it magic. And what if there were those who said, because this is something that is of both, and in the Chinese sense, heaven and earth, therefore this thing is my connection between my character, my cleric or my paladin, my faith, and my deity in heaven. And we'll call this divine magic. And then there are those who connect with it on an internal level. And that's the monk. And that's how I've kind of rationalized it in the world of D&D. That's how it fits. All magic is ki or chi.
Yeah.
And these classes are different cultural traditions in how it is interpreted. And in my mind, that is the one way that you can make it fit into the Forgotten Realms. And because that's how people around the world do that. That's how people around the world rationalize the world around them. Right? That's why, think about it this way, that's why everywhere in the world there is some sort of tradition of a dragon.
So part of the reason that I like the Pathfinder 2 version of the monk more is because they made key points into something just called focus focus spells. And they define focus spells as a special type of spell attained directly from a branch of study from a deity or from another specific source. And multiple classes use these focus spells. Wizards have them. The champion, the Pathfinder 2e version of the paladin, has them too. And that's where the monk's key comes from. And to me, I like that more, and that's more analogous with Daniel's interpretation of key, which I think is how I also view key as fitting into D&D in general, as just a different interpretation of the weave, or of, like, you know, psionic power, or what all these concepts that D&D is already playing with. It removes kind of like the Asian mysticism element to it and makes it into a more kind of a cultural or personal expression of essence, which is what chi, which is what key is.
I just thought of the most cursed analogy for key in D&D, and I was like, keys just midi-chlorians.
Oh God.
I mean, I do get the sense. So
getting into the Force is a whole other.
That's a whole other thing.
Yeah. I feel like we can't get into, but the idea of like midichlorians being a way to quantify the Force, which was already a mystical, unperceivable, immeasurable element of our universe that permeates through our lives and how we perceive things, and then trying to make it midichlorians, which are quantifiable. Like, you have, like, draw blood and measure your midichlorians, measure your key, as it were. I feel like it's a part of like westernization that I feel that the D&D monk has with this. And Daniel, I love this idea of like trying to make the weave and chi like come together in a very harmonious way. But I still see elements of like that westernization there, where, you know, you have to reconcile other things with the weave too. Like I love your idea, but the weave has other things, like deities have like one true name that they identify with. So like Mystra, for example, Mystra is the goddess of magic. But in the like in Karatur, in like the eastern realms, they refer to Mystra as someone else, but Mystra refers to herself as Mystra. And like, that's like really weird. It's like, oh, she just allows all these people to just worship her with a different name, even though she doesn't identify with that name. Like, what does that mean? And then other ideas of like ley lines in Forgotten Realms, they can be perceived. You can see them. So can you quantify them? And then like, where does that intersect with this idea that, you know, we're westernizing this idea that is quite this philosophical concept that's quite hard to grasp even for scholars. And so like, that's the tension I
kind of bring this question to you then. Do those questions need to be answered in the narrative of D&D, or can they remain unanswered? Are we allowed to have mysteries in D&D, or does everything have to have an answer?
Fuck yes.
Right? And that's,
just let it be.
Just let it
nebulous.
Be. Right? You know how there's always the DM who's like, you have a player and they're like, why does this happen? And the GM's like, magic. That's the answer. And then you just forget about it. Magic. Why can't it just be like, forget about it? Chi.
I do want to point out, actually, the thing is, I feel like it's kind of interesting to interrogate this, because I am more familiar with the Western perspective of like the post-Enlightenment way of thinking, of categorizing, and of like separating the mystic from the quote unquote physical and or practical. So like, actually, when I was reading like this article about Chi, that was the first time that I actually was reading on things that were kind of a part of the way that I grew up, but then I never thought about until I was reading. I was like, oh yeah, I guess these are different definitions of it. Like my mom, when we were younger, would always be like, don't eat too much lychee, because your huo qi, your fire qi, is gonna like get real high, and then you're gonna start getting nosebleeds and have like a lot of zits, which turns out did happen. But anyway, I feel like actually this whole like the essence, like being in, I kind of going back to the philosophical and or like physics part of this, which is like, it's like the smallest thing, it's the biggest thing, it encompasses all, it is within all. And I was like, oh yeah, that's very much like, like in Epicureanism, like the whole, that, like, I don't remember what that text is, but like the big book of Epicureanism, not written by Epicure, but like by the next guy, about atoms, like the whole, like this super long poem about atoms and like atomism, like really, like, and it's basically kind of like the same to me, because it's like, oh, it's in the smallest thing, it's in the biggest thing, it's in the rain, it's in the ocean, like it's, so I very much agree with you, Daniel, in that, like, yeah, I think that is how I would think about it. But at the same time, like, Steve, what you said about how, like, this is like a westernization of this concept, that makes me think of, like, right now, well, it's not as popular anymore, but it was very popular, like, within the past 5 years, the xianxia genre, which is, like the supernatural, really like supernatural, like dealing with like gods and like spirits and like all that stuff, like aspect of what was the wuxia genre. It's like evolved into its own subgenre, and in there, a lot of the stuff that I've read, it's like it has that kind of like level up, like very shonen anime vibe, where it's like, oh, I'm gonna cultivate like my inner. It's like, and it's like different types of chi that you can draw in, like different people, they have like an affinity to like different elements, and then they can like channel that and like make themselves stronger. And I feel like that is also like, it's very like it's started in China, and so therefore it's very Chinese by like, default. But the idea is kind of similar to Qi. I mean, it's a very different in application, in that Qi is very restrictive, like what, Daniel, you've said already about how it's limited to like basically what I think of as Neili, like Neigong, where it's like physical and making your body strong. Whereas like that Qi is like really like, it's magic, right? It's like making your body like a vessel to like the most magic you can, so that you can get good and like get all the respect and or like all the riches. It's very, that's why it's very shonen, because it's like very like oh, this is my aspiration, and like if I'm sad in real life, I can read this and feel powerful in the book. But like, so I don't know if I would say that this kind of like quantifying of an essence or an element, not element, essence, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Is like a Western thing. Like, I think this is just a gamifying and or like a thing that will make you feel powerful. Because
I think I like to clarify that, like, when I say Westernization, I don't necessarily mean like it in a way to talk about like the positive or negative aspects of it. I think Westernization and globalization is maybe a better way to describe it, is going to be a natural phenomenon that happens. And when these concepts do come over to Chinese philosophers, like the atoms, for example, like once that comes over and the Chinese philosophers begin to like incorporate and talk about and like, build on that, that is Asian. Like that is part of their identity. They build it, it is theirs. And like having whatever source that Westernization was is kind of not really that important at that point. It's more important about what those individual people feel and how they express themselves, at least in my opinion.
So do you think that maybe it's beyond the idea of cultivation? Because like Agatha, basically you're saying is like cultivation is very similar to your monk leveling up and getting more key points, right? Cultivating more chi or ki to do these more powerful things, right? That makes sense. And I think what Steve is also kind of saying to kind of marry these two ideas is that perhaps it's not the cultivating of chi or ki that we're talking about, but it's more of the intent to which this essence is being used for. Right? Because in a lot of wuxia and xinxia, we see, chi being, we see.
Well, like you've already heard that. I think chi is like a nebulous thing. So when you like, Steve, I think you're saying this about it. then I have to think back, like, is that what I'm thinking
Am I?
about it? Because I don't know by default, and that's like
Yeah.
how I perceive it. It's like it's unknowable.
Yeah,
in, like,
but that's what makes it.
quantifiable way.
That's what makes it so difficult. I was I had a really interesting conversation this week, one that I was not expecting, and it was a job interview for a video game studio, and one of the things that we talked about during the interview was this idea of marrying mechanics or harmonizing mechanics and narrative, and how video games can do this well or do this poorly. When we look at interpretations of D&D in the video game world, so like I just played, like Solasta, which is like it uses the 5e SRD, and then there's like Baldur's Gate and like all these different Divinity, Original Sin, and all that. These kind of take one aspect of D&D, the mechanical aspect of D&D, and replicate them quite well. But what they don't do is take that narrative part. And so when I look at the monk, I look at a class or a style of play, or one of the pillars, I guess, of play in D&D, although the wizards will say the pillars are like exploration and all that stuff. But I mean more style of play. And you see, like, yeah, this is a mechanical way of doing things. But the thing with the monk that makes it very different from the other classes is that the monk's mechanics don't harmonize well with the narrative part of D&D, and players aren't encouraged to do that well. So while you have this ki or this chi, you are told that it is used for combat, and it is used to harm others and fight things, which is only a fragment of what you actually do in D&D. And when you're playing a monk, you're like, well, I'm just an average Joe in the story, right? And that's where I think the monk is really poorly designed, and the way ki is communicated to the players is done quite poorly.
And would you say that it's that different from like the barbarian who has like rage and is also
Exactly
kind of
the
an
same.
average Joe, but just wanders around and gets angry at times?
Exact same thing, right? And that's one of a weakness of a lot of classes in D&D. So I kind of want to combine our two conversations now. This conversation of qi in Chinese culture, because I feel like we could just keep debating qi, and I think that's what these articles.
Can we?
Can we? I think that's what these articles kind of do, because I took this one quote here and I stuck it in our notes, and it was like, a great man regards heaven and earth and the myriad of things as one body. It's so if the man feels empathy for a child in peril, well, they are connected in one body. And if everything living is chi, then they have chi. But then, and it just goes through these different layers of sentience, life, and existence.
But frames it within the idea of suffering, which I think is so interesting.
Okay, so I'll read it out because I thought this was super interesting, and this was the thing that kind of got me thinking even more about qi. So this is from a Ming Dynasty philosopher and calligrapher named Wang Yangming, and he wrote, "The great man regards heaven and earth and the myriad of things as one body. Therefore, when he sees a child about to fall into a well, he cannot help a feeling of alarm and commiseration. This shows that his humanity, benevolence, forms one body with the child. It may be objected that the child belongs to the same species. Again, when he observes the pitiful cries and frightened appearance of birds and animals about to be slaughtered, he cannot help feeling an inability to bear their suffering. This shows that his humanity, benevolence, forms one with the birds and animals. It may be objected that birds and animals are sentient beings like he is, but when he sees grasses and trees, plants, broken and destroyed, he cannot help a feeling of pity. This shows his humanity, benevolence, forms one body with the grasses and trees. It may be said that grasses and trees are living things like he is, yet even, this is the best part, yet even when he sees tiles and stones, shattered and crushed, he cannot help a feeling of regret. This shows that his humanity forms one body with tiles and stones." And linking this back to the, idea that chi is the condition for life. Water and fire have chi, yet lifeless things are formed by chi. And if everything is one body, like you said, Steve, because of this potential shared suffering, or framing it around suffering, then everything has chi. And looking at those two philosophers together made me understand at least a little bit more what chi was.
I will say that, to be honest, I feel like that quote, I was like, why did you put this in here? Because it's very clearly like the intention of that quote was talking about like what makes a person, like what makes, like, I think it's, I don't know what the translation actually is, but I'm pretty sure it's probably about the character E, like, and like what that means, like what makes a person a person. It's more about like the essence of quote unquote man as opposed to this like chi thing. And so I was like, what? That really threw me off when I was reading it. But
the way I interpreted it is when I was reading through this is like humans have chi. And if humans are connected to everything because of this, then does that mean everything has chi?
Yes. I mean,
everything does
that was what
everything does have chi. And that's what they were saying, right? And so I just put those there because I thought it was interesting. But I kind of want to take it back to D&D because I know a lot of people are interested in like the D&D side of this. And how do you kind of marry the two, right? So we have, I think this is a good time to bring up our patron questions. So our patrons, we had 2 questions that I think were really great, and this is the perfect time to kind of talk about them. I'll read them both out, and we can kind of address them. So the first one is, do you recommend mechanical changes or just recontextualization? The base monk has always felt like it's so specific a thing that the monk subclasses feel lacking in many ways. I agree. Second question is the monk as a D&D class worth recontextualizing, or would it be better to just make something new? So the 2 questions kind of like tie into one another. So right now it's just like, is it mechanical change, recontextualization of key, I think is what we should say, and new class. I wanna talk a little bit about like Candlekeep, because it was a really interesting experience for me, and I'm gonna say a couple things that I actually have never said on Asians Represent or publicly about doing Candlekeep. And I have Steve, I don't think it's as good as you want it to be, but I have some objections to how the Book of Inner Alchemy turned out. Now, I think it turned out great. I'm really proud of it. I think it's wonderful. I don't understand why people are like, oh, the Gloves of Soul Catching are OP. Like, the monks got nothing. The monks got nothing. Also,
so you have to do a lot to build.
You have to do a lot to build those things, and you have to be an objectively bad person to build them. But also, the monk has nothing. One of the things that kind of happened when I was pitching this was like, and I put this in the notes. Is like, this has got to be connected to one of the other monk traditions. I want either open hand, or my preference was the long death. Right? And I wanted long death. And Chris Perkins, for very, very good reasons, was like, you can't do that. And I was like, why? And then he was like, because we want the largest, we want to make sure that the biggest group of people can play this, and it's the people who just have the core books.
Yeah.
And so when I was writing all of my amendments to Monk and writing the Book of Inner Alchemy, I could only write it within the context of the potential player or GM only having the Player's Handbook, the Monster Manual, and the Dungeon Master's Guide, and nothing else. So there are a lot of really cool monk things in other books, but I was unable to draw on them or even reference them in Inner Alchemy, because everything in Candlekeep Mysteries had to be related to the core 3 books. And I don't think a lot of people know that.
I think that's how it is for
And it's
all
how it is for
D&D
all of them. But I don't think people
yeah.
think that. They're like, well, why didn't you do this?
Yeah, but you can't.
But you can't.
You can't.
And it's
They
for good
forbid it.
reasons. It's for
Yeah.
good reasons. Like, I get it. But that is a thing to point out when we're talking about, changes made to D&D. Are changes meant to be made in a supplemental book like Von Richten's Guide? Like, these additions? Or do changes need to be made at the level of the core books, right? And it's a very tough question.
They can't even fix the Ranger after so many iterations.
So
yeah,
spicy. So
I mean,
Spicy.
they will. What will happen is that they'll try to change it in a book like Von Richten's. Like there'll probably be a book coming out that will offer in optional rules, but those optional rules, because they're not part of the core trio of handbook, monsters manual, dungeon master's guide, will always be exist on the sidelines, like how you experienced when writing your adventure, Daniel. And so honestly, like, I think the monk will probably only be updated in another edition of the game.
Yeah. And this is also why, I was actually really nervous about
Or we'll receive a canon update, or like
update. So here's the thing.
The game.
I thought about that when I was doing Inner Alchemy, and so I did something to make sure that my changes were canon. And I said that Bak Mei is from Shou Lung. And in saying that Bak Mei is from Shou Lung, immediately made that a part of the D&D world.
Although, was that retained in the final text?
It is. He's a Shou
was, yeah.
human.
Oh, he's a Shou human. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
And the Book of Inner Alchemy is a book from Shou. So I said no. I told my editor, I was like, remove all Karatur. But we kept Shou because like Karatur is like Pan-Asia. Don't want that. But Shou is like China. So Shou is in there. The other thing that I did with Inner Alchemy was I made sure that the adventure was actually not set in another realm. And that if you were to engage in this Asian story, you were going to do it in the Sword Coast. And that's why their hideout is right near Candlekeep. Because I wanted that Asian story and this conversation to be had about mysticism, martial arts, and medicine to take place in the Forgotten Realms. For the exact reason, you mentioned that, like, yeah, all these supplemental books are great, but people ignore them. Like, this is now canon. This is now, literally, in this library, there was an Asian book that talks about qi. Now, the changes that I made, the amendments that I made, certainly do not line up with the philosophy of qi that we've talked about, and it's all of its complexities, yet how simple it is, right? I said three things. I said, though commonly thought of by those outside of monastic orders as mystical energy, qi has strong ties to the element of air, for breath is what connects one's soul to one's essence, right? So the idea there was to demystify it. The second thing,
I loved this when I read it, by the way. Yeah,
Thank
this
you.
was like one of my favorite parts of just the narrative that you wrote.
The second thing is that qi is a vital force present in all living things. Medical techniques and training can be used to control the flow of qi. Now, obviously, qi isn't everything, right? But the objective here was to basically say that you could use it for things that aren't combat. And then the third thing was, all living things are made up of two lives, physical and spiritual, and when these aspects are in harmony, great power can be achieved. And that was just me being like, I want some like cool, like sort of like wuxia sort of thing. But the thing here was that, like, I wanted to provide people with a way of interacting with monk tropes and monk flavor in D&D, but in a non-combat way. And that's where I kind of want us to talk, is how can you take what already exists with the monk if you cannot make these mechanical changes? Like, we talked about this question. Recontextualization it's kind of happened. Inner Alchemy is like a very, very small start, right? But for the reasons you said, Jeremy, supplements that recontextualize qi are often forgotten, right? Or ignored. So we have kind of two things left. we have making a new class, or, well, we don't even talk about mechanical changes. It's a new class, or how do you incorporate key into your narrative more? That's where I kind of want to go next, because that's where I think we're all strong. Even if Agatha is not a D&D 5e player, how can you take what we know about D&D key and weave it into your stories outside of combat? And I would love to hear something from all of us about how you would do that. Like, how would you go and take this thing that the monk has and make a story out of it that doesn't involve killing or fighting, right? How do you go and you'd say, I'm a monk, but I'm going to take a level of sorcerer?
So
how do you take key and make key a part of that story?
So to the first question of like recontextualizing versus mechanical changes, unfortunately, I feel this question, I reject this question respectfully to say that I feel like recontextualization and mechanization kind of go hand in hand. You can't do one without the other.
I think
Yeah.
there should be both, honestly.
Yeah.
That said,
Yeah.
if I had full range and like you told me, see if you can only recontextualize, I can do a lot with the monk class. But Dan, I want to answer your question more directly, which is kind of like changes I would like to see that would be make the monk non-combat oriented, or rather move away from a focus on combat.
Or give the monk narrative utility in addition to its combat utility.
So I go back to like my experience with monks, like Buddhist monks, like either in Niagara Falls, where like you have the 1,000 Buddha like temple, or like in Vietnam, where I saw these monks and we could not communicate whatsoever, but like there was like an understanding there and like that feeling. And all of these experiences that I have, I feel, or sorry, the other experience in the Niagara Falls temple with the 1,000 Buddhas, the experience I had there was watching this monk talk to these tourists that were clearly there to like appreciate the Orientalism of like this area, and just like really try to like put Buddhism in a box that was like convenient for them, which is natural, I think. But I really admire these monks' ability to speak to them, respect them, love them, and then not do what I would do as a child, which was to either get really frustrated or get very overly excited, like almost overcompensating for expressing my identity. They were just always very even and very calm, as if just like riding a wave of emotions, and just it ended where it was going to end. So I take those experiences I had in Niagara Falls, the experience I had in Vietnam, where I spoke to these monks, where I had these unspoken connections. And I think legendary actions actually have a very interesting way of flowing into this concept, because legendary actions are a resource, but they can be used for a lot of different things. And oftentimes they are used for defensive things, just like end and effect. I always find that very, very interesting. But similarly, I do resonate with the idea that there is a pool of energy you can draw from before causing harm to yourself. I would love to see that used for other abilities. There's nothing that restricts the game from saying the monk has flurry of blows and also a restorative thing, a way to
You mean
work with someone and give them a second wind.
You mean second wind for the fighter? Or lay on hands for the paladin?
Well, second wind is only personal.
Yeah.
But I find the idea of like giving someone their second wind, that is a very real thing that I think happens. And that could be reflected within this framework. Or you could recontextualize flurry of blows, which I always was not super comfortable with, because flurry of blows is only for violence. Only ever for violence. It is, you use your bonus action to make, or sorry, you make an extra unarmed attack. But the idea of it is that by focusing on the things that matter the most, by sacrificing the rest, you can do more. So why not make it like expediency of like life and death? So give more actions to which you can use for whatever purpose. Violence, sure. But it could be serving more patients in an infirmary. It could be saying more in an assembly to make sure that your voice is heard. That's how I see kind of monks evolving into a way that both makes it more interesting mechanically, I truly believe, but also better reflecting this idea that they're trying to like scratch the surface of.
Yeah, I think one other thing that can be really interesting about the monks and, like narrative, and like if anybody else would like to go, like please take the reins, right? I think one other thing that could be really neat for wizards to do would be to actually take all these traditions, cobalt soul, open hand, right? 4 elements, and give them like an importance in the world of D&D. Who is the master of the 4 elements, right? Like Bach Mei is the master of the immortal lotus. What do immortal lotus monks do, right? Like that's where you can give them sort of realism in the narrative. How do you learn these things? Oh, I hit this level and all of a sudden I can do these things. That's one of the problems with D&D that are easily mitigated by, of course, saying like, yeah, we're only going to level up when we hit these narrative milestones. And one that I really like for the monk is, it'd be really cool is if, let's say, all of your characters go and they train on a mountain with this monk. And then at the end of that, it's like everybody's going to get a level of monk.
I that was a campaign idea I had that actually never really manifested, but
And I like
that's what I would do in an adventure.
And I like that. And, I like the idea of leveling up and learning having more narrative importance, especially when it comes to something like the monk, because learning and being a disciple and finding a master is an important part of these stories that, we talk about, these wuxia or xianxia stories. And it's like Agatha said, you're literally like, leveling up and becoming more powerful. So why not weave that into your story? I also like the idea of, I think it would be really cool if somehow with chi or ki, the monk could awaken temporary things in other people. Almost like the bard can give bardic inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
The monk could say, unlock meridians in the character to give them like advantage on a thing.
Yeah.
The idea of like a flow of energy, like I will sacrifice the energy that I have so that you get another sorcery point or another spell slot, or like I will take what I understand energy and life and chi to be, and you can have this and you can translate it to whatever your concept is. That's a fucking dope idea.
So
super powerful though.
Yeah, I like that idea a lot. And if the monk were to receive a revision in another edition of D&D, I would like to see something more along those lines, of including some healing potential, perhaps, including the potential to give something like bardic inspiration, or even something like the fighter battle masters, like what superiority die or whatever it is, like helping people in situations like with combat. That's not just like fighting. I would like to see more of that, but I do think the monk is also a victim of this, of kind of the confusion that it's always been wrapped in ever since it first entered the game, where, the first monks in the original version of D&D were criticized for just being OP as hell. And since then they've been, you're pigeonholed as like these heavy DPS, like damage dealers. And I think that is what we need to move away from in future editions the most, that a monk does not necessarily just have to be a pugilist type character. And also, if you're gonna make it a pugilist type character, this is along the lines of reconceptualizing and mechanics. If you're gonna make it a pugilist that is very obviously inspired by like Kung Fu and Shaolin monks, then go all the way, and don't call it key points, call it chi points, and offer in some other things that are not just relying upon ki to do your attacks. Do something with other weapons, other forms of martial arts.
So let's
do something like stances, which is what I like in Pathfinder Second Edition. I want to see, if you're going to make a hokey monk that is obviously influenced off of like martial arts movies, then how come you don't have like different stances in there?
How come you're limiting the weapons that they can use as well?
Why are you limiting things? So the monk often suffers from being, in many ways, a half measure, which is, people in the chat are bringing up the Order of Mercy subclass, which is a healing monk. in another book that unfortunately was interpreted as like a Western plague doctor traveling around healing people. Like I feel
Yeah.
like that is missing the point of the monk, and kind of like D&D sort of pulling away from the monk a little bit, because they're like, oh, people criticize this class or say that it's problematic. Okay, we're gonna make the only Asian class in the game non-Asian,
Yeah.
which I don't think is the right way to go, in my personal opinion.
So if we were to say fix the monk, there are a couple of things that like obviously need to be discussed, right? The first thing that, so if you know, all four of us, Wuxia was like, okay, Steve, Jeremy, Agatha, Daniel, y'all are gonna fix the monk. We're gonna lock you in a room for a week. We'll feed you. Just fix this thing, please, and we'll pay you. What would you do? And I
Like,
think that
like in the first season of House of Cards.
I have never watched House of
Except
Cards.
it's figuring out.
I forgot about that.
Yeah.
House of Cards. What an interesting series.
Yeah.
On and off
Yeah.
screen.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I would say don't hire me.
I
I'm not
would,
saying
use
this
your, I
job.
would use your idea, Daniel, that you just brought up.
No,
and,
I was-
and build on that.
So the awakened one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Boom. If somebody makes that, yo, TM. Here's my idea. There are a couple things. First things first, from a design perspective, you need to step back and say, well, what are the goals with this class? Is this class going to lean heavily into the spirituality of the martial arts? Or is this class going to literally be like, is that me? Am I going to be like Assam and Warrior, and I'm just going to be a badass motherfucker, right? Am I going to be that? Or am I going to be like Tony Jaa in every Tony Jaa movie? I just wreck people's days, right? Or am I going to be, you know, the main characters of Word of Honor? Beautiful, high charisma, but also like very skilled at fighting, but also with these abilities. So the thing that I would say is like, do I want to make a class that is specifically drawing on this idea of, we would rename it Chi? Is it going to be a Chi-based class? If it is a Chi-based class, what I would do is I would lean in very heavily into, you know, cultivation, right? And you can work that into how you rest in D&D, right? How you rest, how you meditate, right? How you gain Chi. But I would also, you know, say that as this character progresses, you get to make essentially two sort of broad choices. As a cultivator of Chi, do you lean heavily into the hard styles of martial arts or the soft styles of martial arts? And then each of these would come with their own unique abilities. If I were to go with a Chi-based character, this would 100% be that Negong Neja sort of character, right? You're using your mind, your spirit, and your Chi to engage in these feats. You would be able to do things in and out of combat like Qinggong, like that lightening of your body, right? Feather falling, nullifying poisons within yourself, healing others. These would all be really cool things. Or awakening abilities in others. If I wanted to go for like, I'm Sammo Hung and I want to be a fighter, well, that's not a monk. That's a fighter subclass called the martial artist. And I think that's what would have to be done. Because
you wouldn't take
go
the
ahead.
monk and do like a 2 subclass division, new subclasses, where you took those 2 ideas and just used them as the main kind of options you could take as you level up your character?
You could,
I have a
but you still
question
have to
about
figure out
that.
where Chi kind of fits. Like, because in the monk, all of a sudden at level 2, you have Chi, right? You have Ki at level 2.
What if it was just
And-
the thing you had at level 1?
Yeah, then
The thing is-
then I would do that.
Okay.
I don't actually. I don't think that having both Waija and Neja be like just the 2 branches from the monk class, I don't think that is great. Only not in terms of like the mechanics and design standpoint, but in terms of like the kind of stereotyping that would perpetuate, which is that like monk as a class is supposed to be basically like a Shaolin monk, right?
Yeah.
But then like, so then it's like, then like that is kind of accurate, right? Like Shaolin is very much Wuxia. It's like training your body to be mega strong. But like the whole like cultivating thing is not within the Shaolin tradition, and but the thing is, that's what people think about when you think about the word monk and when you think Asian, right? So I feel like it might be good to like separate those two things, so that then this will actually help people to like have a better understanding of like what martial art can be within like the Eastern tradition.
And
like
that was
Chinese
my initial pitch of separating the two, right? Having a martial artist. So, and you remember Agatha 10 minutes ago, you said, don't hire you?
Yeah.
Take that
true.
back.
Give me the money, JK. But yeah.
I think what could also be interesting is that you could lean into other archetypes. So, you know what's really cool? And this is something that we're kind of playing around with in Dungeons and Asians, currently on hiatus for medical reasons. But with Steve's character is a Yosha, which is like a wandering sort of vagabond. And this is also a really interesting idea because it's a narrative sort of archetype in Wuxia, but also could be a really interesting way to combine, you know, chi cultivation with sort of the narrative tropes of the D&D ranger or the rogue, which is what we did. Right?
It is, yeah.
It's exactly what we did. And that's where I think you could go in having more classes that potentially use chi in different ways or understand chi in different ways, whereas you would have that one class, that cultivator, which is what I might call it, the cultivator, be the master of chi.
You know, it's interesting.
Mastery.
It's interesting because that's already kind of built into D&D by default with the whole idea of multi-classing. You have subclasses taking a level. Oh, sorry, not subclasses, but you have like a fighter taking a level of monk. You have a rogue doing the same thing. Within the game itself, that is allowed. Yet, I feel like Go ahead, Steve.
I would comment though that multi-classing has an implication mechanically, which is you will never achieve your capstone, which is, I think, the wrong message when it comes to this idea. The idea that if you don't specialize, you will never master it. I think that's like interesting.
But I also think is
that like a consequence of D&D just being sort of like a game with clearly defined roles? Would Daniel's idea of like a cultivator being the master monk fix that, or just kind of lean more heavily into
I think it's multiple changes. I don't think there's a single solution in a tabletop role-playing game where obviously one of the things you have to take into account of is that anything can happen, right? So you can make these mechanical changes that go alongside these recontextualizations of how real-world cultures influence game design. But at the same time, you also have to think about player behavior. And one thing that I wanted to circle back to is the idea of leveling up and multi-classing in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you know, when I'm doing D&D and what I would like to try with my group, if any of you are watching this, we're going to do this, is if you want to level up or multi-class, you have to find a teacher.
Cool.
Right? And that way you can work it into the story.
Cool.
That way it makes sense. That way you could do like, I'm going to help you awaken these abilities and harness what is already in you and in the broken tiles and in the broken rocks and in the depressing grass and in, you know, all of this stuff. Like, Agatha.
I have a suggestion. So I think it would be really cool to it seems like the solution that is the vibe of the solution is to have different aspects of what was all supposed to be the monk class, but then instead have them be either different classes or different subclasses. And so like, what if the umbrella is called cultivator? And then you can like go into different things. Like the monk is very much the Shaolin monk. And then one is like, I don't know, maybe like, well, I mean, if we really want to
make
go to
monk itself
like,
a subclass.
Monk
Interesting.
itself is
Yeah.
so I like the
Yeah.
idea. So because I'm just writing
Because
this down
I
into
really
our
want-
notes.
what I would love to see in this like umbrella is to have like a chi focused class that is all about the magical aspect of it. The same way that like there seems to be a lot of like magic classes and subclasses, like because I'm thinking about, well, like if you think about Avatar, I guess, or like just like a lot of xianxia where it's like it's about mastering like an element, and then you do like elemental attacks and things like that. Like I think that would be sick to be like, okay, like so instead of it being really restricted to this idea, this cultural idea of this monk, and then also this like key points, but it's like instead it's like chi, which can be these things and therefore is expressed mechanically in that you can be like physical fighter, you can be some kind of like I'm not like maybe like more support kind of person. So like what you were saying about like helping other people get temporarily regain other things based on you spending your own chi points, or like magical DPS, right? I think that would be really cool.
Do you know what would be neat to add to that? You know, one of the cool things that I really loved about, and there were problems to it, of course, but one of the interesting things about like previous editions of D&D is when you wanted to get into these prestige classes, you had to do these like very specific things, right? It's like you the one that always caused a lot of hilarity at the table for me when I was young was, I'm a sorcerer and I want to be a spell sword. That one was tough because for Agatha, the spell sword was basically a magic user who was trained in wearing armor. And because in 3rd edition and 3.5 D&D, there was this thing called arcane spell failure. And basically it was a percentage.
or the did they call it the Magus?
The Magus was
yeah.
But basically, the more restrictive the armor, there was a percentage that you could fail at casting a spell.
It sucks. It
sucked, but it also made sense because it's like I need to move my hands, and if I'm wearing plate armor, I'm like fireball, and just right. You need to be able to move. But the spell sword was trained in casting spells in armor.
Closest thing to it now is the Blade Singer.
Yeah.
In 5e.
But in the
Which
prerequisite,
was originally like said only elves can be blade singers, which
like the arcane archer, right?
Thankfully they retconned that.
But in order to be a spell sword as a sorcerer or wizard, I think it was as a wizard, you had to best somebody in melee combat or in non-magical combat. So me as a sorcerer, I'm like, I gotta go pick a fight with somebody that I can beat, and then the G would always fuck with me. And it would be hilarious because I'm like, I'm going to go like, you know, in Kung Fu Hustle, when he goes into town, he's like, you, shorty, and he stands up, is super tall.
Yeah.
That's that scene for me trying to become a spell sword, and it never ends well. And, you know, the lady like kicks my ass, right? And then I eventually become a spell sword. I like the idea of prerequisites for a lot of these like cultivator subclasses. It's like, yeah, if I want to be a Yosha, I have to do something narratively to give myself this sense of freedom, to demonstrate how I strike out against the bureaucracy, right? Or it's like, I want to be, you know, I want to go deep into this cultivation. Narratively, I need to do that, like, it's like chi gathering. Like, you know, you sit in nature and you absorb chi from the world. I need to find a place and I need to do this, right? I like these narrative prerequisites to this cultivator class because it makes you really think about the story you want to tell as your character levels up and this unfolds. So yes,
oh my gosh, this is so hype.
Like you're a level 1. I got that. This is why for Dungeons and Asians Revenge of the Mountain Orchid I wanted to do 5e. This is my pitch. This is my pitch to you, Agatha. We'll do the cultivator.
Agatha, there sort of is like a monk subclass that kind of leans into like elemental magic, way of the four
It's
elements.
the four elements, but it's you're the avatar.
Kind of like avatar style. You're basically avatar. The thing is, like,
Hmm.
I really like your
gotta be
idea,
five
Agatha,
elements,
of
though.
making like a cultivator the main kind of class, and then having various types of cultivator, the monk just being one of those. It's just I wonder. I feel like D&D would never do that because they would see that as stepping on the toes of other established classes like the sorcerer or like the cleric. And so I'm wondering from a design perspective how you would kind of do that.
So
Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
my thinking here was actually Vampire the Masquerade, which
Ooh.
hear me out.
Okay.
Vampire the Masquerade picked the clans based on gothic horror themes. So every clan is actually supposed to represent a genre of horror, right? Like the Nosferatu are supposed to be like the visceral, like ugly horror of
That was my
monsters.
favorite. That was my favorite clan.
Peter.
Then you have other clans which are more about like the animalistic side of being undead and things like that. And everyone struggles with their humanity within the horror trope. For monks, based on a conversation, I think there's an opportunity to actually have a game that focuses on your tradition of being a monk, how you perceive manipulation of the world around you, whether it be internally, externally, positively, negatively, all these kind of things. And then you have the tension of being, well, a person who has to live in the world. So I like the idea that from a meta sense, that the ideas of monks represent the different ways of actually perceiving and like the philosophies around chi. And I think that's like a compelling thing to dive into. I need way more time to make that into a game if it was going to happen. But I see these threads of connection and whatnot.
I feel like it's becomes another game by itself. Like it kind of stops being D&D and just like make the monk game. I mean,
if they remade Karatur, this is what would be written into it.
What would be written? This is the kind of conversation that would have to happen when remaking something like Karatur.
I think this is Jeremy, that's a really good point, because that is one thing that that is a blind spot for me in terms of like what kind of classes are there already, and then also what kind of niches they fill. Because when I read only cursorily the different classes, subclasses, and then like also like the different level up paths that you can do, it does seem like there is already a lot of overlap. I don't know if that's actually true, but it just feels like, for example, like with the warrior, like the psionic warrior, which I think is really cool. That is my favorite thing out of it. But I'm like, but that is like magic, right? So like, what's the difference between that and like, for example, like what you said about sword, the
spell sword.
The spell sword.
Spell sword. Like, what's the difference, like mechanically, not in terms of narrative?
The scions got these psionic points and crystals.
You're like a mutant and you got psionic points.
They had their own
but that's narrative, right? That's not.
It's mechanical. It's mechanical.
Yeah, it's mechanical. You have psionic points, like key points.
You've got psionic points. You got key points, and they're all different.
Right, and it's like, okay, right. Okay, so the points are the difference between a spell sword and, say, like the psionic warrior. But then, what's the difference between a psionic warrior and a monk that has key points? I guess it's
what they can do with the points. That's literally it. And that was my pitch. That chi is everything. Chi is the essence that the cultivator monk uses to do these great feats. Chi is the power that is innate to the sorcerer, that manifested the sorcerer's natural magical abilities. Chi is the thing that connects. Remember that poem about suffering, that analogy about suffering, that connects the cleric or the paladin to their deity, that enables that connection. They might call it faith, but that is chi.
Well, what I think I'm still thinking about this in terms of the mechanics, right? Because I think Jeremy, that's what you were touching on, which is
Yeah, and I think basically like classes like the psionic fighter or whatever, they're the like subclasses exist for that reason, so that you can be a clearly defined like fighter or a cleric. These are clearly defined core roles. Like the cleric is healer, the fighter is the expert at weapons, the rogue is the sneaky one. The monk is defined as that unarmed like badass, like based in that Shaolin tradition. And the
right.
subclasses are meant to like kind of allow you to, I don't know, like go out of those lines a little bit. And that's basically what I think like another edition of D&D would do. I just can't see them making a cultivator class, even though how that would be awesome. I see them keeping with that hardcore Shaolin monk, trope, but then adding in like a base healing monk subclass within the core rule book in order to give people who want to not only focus their key points into battle something to do. Like, and so I guess from a like a design perspective, I just don't see them budging from that core idea of like the monk as like flurry of blows. I'm gonna use unarmed attacks on you. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that is a very good point in terms of like the actual, because like we were talking about dream design, like, and so therefore like dream design, just make cultivator as like the main class, so like it'll be the new archetype, and then under that
is everything
will
else.
fall monk.
Yeah, and I think that steps on the toes of the other core class, which is why I like, to me that's
But
a
that's
whole
why
other
it's a
game.
different game. That's why you said
it becomes a different
But
game.
actually, then that's the thing is like I don't actually think that it does step on the toes of the other things, right? Because it's still it has the monk, and then like for example, if you were doing like the more elemental aspect, then and you use like key or chi points, however you want to define it, and there like I think there's a lot of potential for like designing new ways of doing it, like, or maybe if you don't do the elemental stuff, you do one that's more like feng shui, so like the Taoist kind of thing, so it's very much like it's very much about like there's like a word for it where you do it's control focused, right? So it's much more about like managing the environment, and then like this like wide area, like like I feel like
I get you there. I think 5e in particular, this edition is very careful about the classes that they introduce into the game. And so that's why I can't see it for 5e. I can see it for 3.5, because 3.5 had all types of class, like the kineticist, which just like uses fire magic and stuff like that. I have trouble seeing it for 5e, mainly because there's this Wizards of the Coast belief that keep everything like streamlined and simple. But I definitely think you have a point there, Agatha, and I like the idea of the cultivator being like a whole new class, but I think it would require some very careful writing and design to keep it from
stepping. So basically what you're saying is that if you were to make a cultivator and you would give all these subclasses these abilities, people would basically be like, yeah, but the rogue can already do that.
That's what people would say
fighter can
with
already
5e.
do that.
Yeah, that's what people would say with
that,
5e.
and I think that's the point Jeremy's making, Agatha, is that it would always draw comparison. But the thing is, that's if we look all around us in the world, there will always be things to compare. But
so
I think really what underlies
are we saying that 3.5 was better with all of its classes?
Yo, I fucking love 3.5.
Yeah. Are we getting into edition wars here?
Now, Edition Wars is another series that we're going to be doing.
Are we?
No. You know how one shot you know how One Shot Network has System Mastery? We're gonna do System Wars, and it's gonna be a battle royale. We're gonna have a bracket of all the different systems. No, we're not gonna do that. 100%, we're not gonna do that. Although I think that's a kind of a cool idea. But no,
it is a cool idea, but it's not the vibe of our channel.
It's not the vibe.
It's not our brand.
I'm gonna branch off, start my own channel.
Yeah, like make a really aggressive username and always like, hey, man,
it's my gamer tag. It's my gamer tag, Bryce Powered. That's my gamer tag.
The interesting thing about Edition Wars is that in 4e, monks were not a core class. They were introduced much later. And
so maybe for 6th edition, like things changed so drastically between editions.
I don't know.
Look, Wizards. I know we're critical of D&D, but we're critical of D&D because we care, right? That's really the core of it.
Yeah.
You know, like I think the big thing about Asians Represent is that we're not just here to complain. We're here to offer actionable advice on what to do. And that's always been what Asians Represent is all about. Now, that said, we could talk about this for a very long time. And we should certainly revisit this in a future episode. And I think we have a lot of people to thank for our ability to do that, and that's our wonderful patrons. Shout out to our amazing patrons for,
Yes.
helping us bring Asians Represent back. I am so proud of the fact that, Asians Represent is back and that we are so close to hitting our goal of Bubble Tea Book Club. Bubble Tea Book Club is going to be our first Patreon sort of stretch goal, and the concept is simple. We're going to buy our guests some bubble tea. We're going to also buy an indie RPG by an indie Asian creator, and we're going to talk about all the things we love about it live. And we need 50 patrons. If you're a $2 patron or if you're an amazing, most honorable patron, we just need 50. We just need 50 to make Bubble Tea Book Club a reality. But that said, Asians Represent is back, and we're back with like a vengeance. I'm so proud of what we've done so far, and I can't wait for us to do a follow-up conversation about it. I can't wait for us to get into like a crazy, or I guess I should say a really wild Discord chat where we try to make the cultivator. Oh, my Zoom, I just like vanished.
Wow.
My chi is so strong.
Your key points.
My goodness.
Yeah, I don't know what happened there. This is technical difficulties. There we go. Oh, I harnessed my key to become invisible. If you folks are listening on the audio, something is going on with the webcam. That said, we are going to we're going to definitely cover this again, but there's so much to talk about on Asians Represent, and it's all possible because of our patrons. So, shout out to our Disciples of the Sky Court, our amazing $5 patrons, our Guardians of the Realm, Brooke, Jeremy, and Daisy.
Jeremy.
Thank you so much. And I get to say this every other week, and I'm so happy because I know it's going to make Liana very upset when they watch this. Our most honorable patrons, the most honorable Ryan the Wizard Hull, the most honorable Metal Weave Games, the most honorable Valorous Games, and Matt, a.k.a. the most honorable Dungeon Glitch. That actually sounds really funny. Thank you so much for your support. I'm so grateful that you folks have been able to, help us out with all things Asians Represent. Marla here, thanks you so much, because every stream we bring on Marla. And here's Marla. Marla, say hi to everyone.
Hi, Marla.
Oh, no.
Marla, are you going to say something?
Marla's like in the shadow realm.
Ghost
Marla
webcam.
is like a shadow
Don't
cat.
pee on me, okay? Bye, Marla. I'm going to
A
fix
displacer
the webcam.
beast.
A displacer beast. There we go. Okay, and all right. There's Marla.
Marla has the most key out of all
Marla, are
of
you
us.
going to say something to the audience about how much you love Dungeons and Dragons? No? Okay. Bye, Marla.
Hi, Marla.
That said, I want to thank all of y'all for tuning in to this episode of Asians Represent. Make sure that you check out all of Jeremy's work. Click on all of Jeremy's links.
Thank you. Yes, give me the clicks.
Click on all of Jeremy's links and read everything that Jeremy writes, because Jeremy has a lot of good to say. And Jeremy, you have definitely contributed to the world of D&D in such a positive way. And I'm so happy that we met. And I'm like, it's wild that we met because of Oriental Adventures.
Some good comes out of everything.
Some good comes out of everything. And I'm so happy that happened. That said, I'm Daniel.
I'm Agatha.
I'm Steve.
There we go. And you've just listened to Asians Represent.
Represent.
Yeah, we did it. We did it. Stick around, folks. We are going to be raiding another channel. And bear with us while we do that. Take care, everyone.